Hey, everyone, and welcome to Think, Engage, Thrive, where we try to bring you the most exciting entrepreneurs and talk about entrepreneurship. We have some great guests all the time, but we've got a great one tonight from over in England, Jim James. You're going to love this guy. He talks about building businesses over the past 25 years from a suitcase. I'm assuming that means he travels a lot. He's been to a whole bunch of different countries. I mean, you want to talk about stories. He's got a million different stories. Jumping out of airplanes, he racing cars. He was involved in the car business. He's been in, I believe, Taiwan and China and all over the place. He's really done some great things. He was an interim CEO at Lotus Automobile. He was an importer of Morgan Motors. Really done some tremendous and exciting things. Published author. He has a podcast, which we'll get into. It's called the UnNoticed Entrepreneur, which is actually a really cool name when you think about it, because most of his focus has been on building businesses using public relations. And we've talked about this a million times, and you know how I feel about public relations. I think it's a great way to accelerate a startup and to use that. That's just another tool. Sometimes, in a lot of cases, it's far more effective than running ads, far more effective than anything else you can do. Again, it depends on the kind of company, but he's going to talk a little bit about why he believes that too. So I think we're very much aligned when it comes to public relations. And when you talk about influence, I know everybody thinks influencers and they think immediately social media, but public relations and using the press is really influence. So we could talk more about his background. I'll let him go into it a bit, but I just gave you a little teaser about it. Really accomplished guy. EO, we've talked about EO. He brought EO over to China, and so he's really an interesting guy. I've had many conversations with him, and I thought it would be great to have him on the show. So, Jim, welcome to the show, and thanks for coming on. I know it's late for you in England, but really appreciate you coming on. Really interesting background. So,
well, Phil, thank you very much for the introduction. And I feel with all the references to Asia, I should be saying ni hao. I should be introducing myself in Chinese and calling myself Jinbao. Jinbao Jie is my Chinese name, which means golden treasure.
yeah.
So I left that golden treasure in China, brought a little bit of treasure home with me with my Shanghainese wife and my two Chinglish daughters. And really happy and delighted to be on the show. Thanks. I've enjoyed our conversations before now. I really like what you're doing with the show in terms of really helping entrepreneurs and startups to get ahead with marketing. So I'm all ears and all here for you to share whatever I can that might be of use.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to come on. Why don't you have this tremendous, interesting background, and I'd love to explore it. Why don't you just walk everybody through sort of where you started, because you've lived on multiple continents, you grew up in multiple continents, you've had this vast experience jumping out of airplanes, racing cars, doing all these different things. I think it's just fantastic. So why don't you just walk us through how that all came about?
Well, thanks for that. The way you explained it, I feel as though that's the life I wish I'd led, and then I said, well, actually, I did lead that life. Hang on, that is me, but you just make it sound so much more fun and appealing. Basically,
it's pretty fun to me.
Well, if I have a slightly American accent, it's because I was at the age of 3 in South Carolina, and then at the age of 8 in Africa, and then at 11 in Colorado, and then at 19 in Chapel Hill as an undergrad. And then I went to Singapore in 1995 to start my first business, and then went to China in 2004. So you're right, I've managed to live around the world, but I really started all of this by jumping out of an airplane. You've alluded to that, and I feel like I should really share that. Basically, at the age of 17, I won a place to go to Australia on a tour called Operation Rally. 3-month expedition. You had to compete to get on. and they just took a few people every 3 months, and he did an adventure somewhere around the world. And I'd won a place to go to Australia from England, but I was only 17. Parents were like, well, that's great, but how are you going to afford to get there? Dad's an academic, mother's a social worker, not coming from an entrepreneurial background or particularly wealthy one. And I was working selling toys, Phil, So I was selling toys at £3.48 an hour, which is what we used to get back in those days in a little brown envelope. And when I did the maths, I realized I was never going to make enough money in time to get to Australia. So I have to do something different. So I thought, why don't I do something that no one else would do themselves? These days, people kind of do bungee jumping, but back in, this is the late 80s, people were a lot more conservative, especially in England, in a small country village. So I led on this idea, I'll jump out of an aeroplane and get it sponsored. And in that afternoon of jumping out of an aeroplane, it made more money than I would have done working for months selling toys. And I just went, wow, this is how you can make money, right? You make something up. You go around and tell everyone what you're going to do. You kind of pre-sell it. They all go, this is a really great idea. I wouldn't do it myself. It's a bit scary, but you do it. I'll pay you some money. So then I got this money, but then I thought I've got to also buy the boots and the backpack and so on. And I went to a shop and I said, you know what? I have some money, but I don't want to spend it all because I need it when I'm in Australia. How about if you give me some equipment, I'll get you some coverage in the local newspaper. And they said, oh, well, if you could, we would. So I went to the newspaper and said, I've got this great story for you. I'm going to Australia. Very few people get chosen. I'm the only one in my town that's going to go. This shop will give me some free equipment. Isn't that a great story? I said, that's a great story. So I went back to the shop and said, right, you better give me the equipment because the journalist is coming in an hour. And so I got this press coverage. The shop was like, that's fantastic. And the newspaper was like, well, that's fantastic. And I've got them both to agree before the other one had actually agreed, right? I'd kind of pre-sold. And I came with it from thinking, actually, this is possible. You can make something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning of realizing, with a little bit of, maybe a chutzpah, a little bit of dynamism, but a bit of creativity, a bit of energy, and getting people engaged in the idea that you could create something from nothing. So that was really the beginning for me of realizing that I was probably always going to have to be an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
So I managed 3 years working for other people. Phil, I was a bit of a failure at being an employee because I was like, okay, I finished what you asked me to do. What next? And they were like, well, that's it. That's all we need you to do. And I was like, well, yeah, but there's so much more to do. And they're like, yeah, but we're not going to do that this year. So that's when I went to Singapore in 95 to start my business at the age of 27 with those 2 suitcases, which I then took to China a decade later. So they're my lucky suitcases.
That's a great story. That's fantastic. So you went to Singapore, and so you went to Australia, I would assume.
Went to Australia, then came back to university, then went to Chapel Hill, then came back to England, did a couple of years working for other people. Didn't like much the weather, didn't like the kind of attitude in the UK in the 1990s. And so that's when I fell in love with Asia. This is just before the internet. It was really coming out, 1995. So in those days, when you left home, you left home.
Yeah.
You didn't really make phone calls. You had envelopes and letters to write.
Yeah.
So it was a wonderful, wonderful way to spend my late 20s.
That's a fantastic story. I think it's a story that a lot of people wish they did when they were younger, right? When you talk to people and you go, oh, I wish I had done that when I was younger, but you actually did it. You had that desire to do it. And I think it shows the power of publicity, because that publicity helped you fund that trip.
Yeah. And in fact, what I did, Phil, was when I was going to Singapore to start my company, I made a logo. You're a marketing guy, so you'll appreciate this. I made a logo by asking my grandparents neighbors who were from Hong Kong. I said, I want a word that means to communicate or to say something. And this lady, Manwa, her name, said, well, you could use the word tung, which means to go through. And actually, it's used on a lot of shipping containers. And so I said, oh, tung. So she drew for me this character. And in those days, we didn't have Canva, we didn't have laptops. Right. So I took this and then I printed out on a regular old Word document the words East and West, and I stuck them with sellotape on a piece of paper on either side of the tongue, painted the tongue in red, and took it to a friend and said, can you make this into my business cards for me? And so what I then did, I did a press release to the media in the broadcast and TV industry, which is the one that I was working in. And I sent a press release saying, I'm going to be going to Asia in June of 1995. And I sent this press release in April because in those days you sent it in April, they got it in May, it maybe appeared in June, right? So by the time I got off the plane with my suitcases in Singapore on a 30-day tourist visa, if you don't mind, I was that all prepared. I actually had press coverage saying I was setting up a business in Singapore.
That's funny.
And so I was able to take that to people and say, hi, I know you don't know who I am, but look, I'm in the magazine. And that's something that you've mentioned at the beginning of the show. Influencers, the original influencers actually were the editors, the editors and the journalists. They were the people who agreed to put you in the newspaper or the magazine or on the radio and TV.
Yeah.
And if you could get them, and still today, if you can get them to cover your story, that gives you credibility as a third-party endorsement. So that was part of the strategy that I used when I went to a new place, because in Singapore I didn't actually know anybody. Just to make this sound even more insane, I didn't really know anybody. I had a couple of suitcases and I was on a tourist visa. But what I did know was that Asia was expanding. Asia was going digital, and that you're only young once. And that it was worth having a go at seeing what I could create for myself at that time in my life.
That's tremendous. You didn't know anybody there.
I had one person that I'd met as a recruitment consultant, and in a bar one time when I'd gone on a trade show, and I said, I know I didn't get any job from you, but I've come anyway. Can we meet? And he said, when do you want to meet? I said, well, anytime, really. I'm just here. I don't know anybody else. But in a way, it's very liberating, Phil. It's very liberating to go somewhere where you don't have an identity, where you don't have any networks. You create a whole new set of stories about yourself, challenges for yourself, social networks. So it's very cathartic, challenging at the same time. But it was a really wonderful opportunity to see what I could really do. And I used to have a poster in my bedroom, and it was a skier jumping off a mountain, and it said, which I got from Boulder when we lived there in Colorado.
Yeah.
Said we only accomplish in proportion to what we attempt. And so anyone that's listening to this and thinking, oh, well, there needs to be some security, there needs to be some reassurance. We can't know all of the answers before we start on the journey. You can really only see around the first corner, and you have to be in the first corner before you can sort of start to see around that. So that was really the whole idea as well, was to just create a new lease of life for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also probably a little bit scary. It's the unknown. And it's like, we've talked about this on the show a lot with entrepreneurs and people who have started businesses. And, I've always asked the question, what do you think is one of the biggest attributes of entrepreneurs? And it comes back to not afraid to take the risk, not afraid to do things. Because I do think that what stops people from achieving what they want to achieve is that fear of the unknown. Well, if I do this, I have a nice job right now. I have an income. If I do this, I'm not going to have that income, and something could happen. And if it doesn't work, then, and it's that fear of the unknown. And the people who get over that fear, or the people who don't pay attention to that fear, are generally the ones who are a bit successful. And, um, you know, but I always tell, and I also hear that from young entrepreneurs that there's that fear. And I always say the same thing. You're not going to die, and you probably still have family that you can go back to, because what's the worst that can happen? You lose money, and then you can start all over again. It's not going to kill you.
And if I may, Phil, I think it's great. I mean, a couple of things. One is that you can always go back to where you were. You can always rewind. And because you had all those skills and all those connections before, they haven't disappeared. So you can always go back and get that job or that kind of job that you had before you left. But actually what happens is once you've taken the leap, there are a whole set of new skills and insights. And what happens is you're not trying to accomplish more with the same skills and insights that you had when you left, because the very process of leaving, the very process of detaching, the very process of assembling your money and your visas and your flights and your connections, that creates learnings, right? That creates skill sets. And actually it helps you to know how to add value, because you become resilient and you become independent, and you also recognize the need to serve others in order to get your own needs met. So by moving out of your comfort zone, actually you become a great servant of those people that might be clients. Because when you're in a comfort zone, you don't really need anybody, really, because you've got the job, you've got the car. You can actually become a little bit complacent.
Yeah.
So I think that one of the things we don't really mention is that being in the environment of risk sharpens your metal. And I think that's also really one of the reasons why, after a decade in Singapore, and I built one of the largest tech PR firms in Southeast Asia called East West Public Relations, which I sold last year to the next generation of entrepreneurs after 25 years. But I got stale, Phil, and that's why in 2004 I went to China to learn Mandarin. I took 2 months out to go and learn Chinese, and then in 2006 I went back to China, because at the age of 40 I thought I can either come back to England and get middle-aged and get fat and and kind of atrophy, really, which I think is terrifying for me. I thought, why don't I go to China, where again, I don't really know very many people. I don't know the language, but it's like the Everest of entrepreneurship. It's like the next mountain to climb is the next set of big challenges. And so that's why I went to China then in 2006 and stayed there until 2019. So this idea that what you give up is all that you're ever going to have, I think is not a healthy mindset.
Yeah.
Because you're going to acquire so many new things, because God is fair, right? God says, hey, you've taken this risk, you challenged yourself. Here are some rewards. Here are some insights. Here are some new connections. Here are some friendships. Here are people who are going to appreciate what you're doing and going to reach out to you. And I think it's, in a way, allowing yourself to be vulnerable in that moment and saying, okay, it's okay if I lose what I had before, because I'm going to gain something else. I don't know what it is yet, but there will be something on the other side of this decision. And that, of course, for me, makes life fundamentally stimulating. I've been terrified. I've been a little bit stressed, a lot stressed, and I've been anxious, but I've never been bored.
Yeah.
Right. And it depends what is your motivator, what's your driver. And as an entrepreneur, it's really, really important what your driver is. But I hate boredom. I can't handle that, really. So for me, being an entrepreneur, creating things from nothing, and it's jumping out of a plane or starting the British Motorsport Festival in China, for example, I think that's one of the great rewards of life, is that you can build something from nothing and learn in the process of doing that and generate some money and some success for yourself and those around you. That for me, Phil, is kind of what life for me is what I want it to be about. It's not for everybody, and nor should it be, but that for me is part of my kind of life path.
Yeah, I can understand that. I'm a person who doesn't like to be bored either. But the other thing I don't like is to get stale either. I don't like to be um, I don't like to do the same thing over and over again for 10 years, 15 years. We have an agency, and
Yeah.
I can easily see how we can get stale, but we generally try and push ourselves to stay on top of what's changing and learning new things and not doing the same old thing. Because like you, I don't like to be bored, and I don't like to get stale. I do like, one of the reasons I like doing this show is because I like to listen to people like you who inspire me in different ways, and I like to hear what other people are doing and what people are thinking. So I can understand exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and I think Phil, you had your 800 raises, which we talked about when you came on the UnNoticed Entrepreneur podcast, my show, and you've created this show as well on E360. So it's part and parcel of being an entrepreneur. I'm not sure which one comes first, probably the desire not to be bored or the creating things, probably they go hand in hand. But as you say, it's in your DNA, right? And actually an agency is a great vehicle for innovation, is it? Because you've always got different clients. So I also really like the PR firm. What I found a little bit Groundhog Day was, to build a successful business, you need to build processes that are repeatable and you get known for some kind of work. If you're always reinventing yourself because as an individual you get bored, the company and the brand positioning can't always keep up with the way that the entrepreneur matures. And I had a podcast guest on my show, and I knew the minute I mentioned that I'd forget. And her company's called Muse out of New Orleans, and I knew it'll come to me. Senior moment, Phil.
Yeah.
Senior moment. But she talks about constructive divergence and about how entrepreneurs or founders and the business brand at some stage often need to diverge because we grow at a slightly different rate, pace, in a different direction than the business we've set up. And one of the areas that I've been thinking about a lot is how founders at some stage need to have their own personal brand. And they have a company brand and a personal brand, because actually the entrepreneur after 3, 5, 8 years or so, probably 3 to 5, starts going, that's great, it's up and running, I've got a team. Now I get a professional to run from an operational point of view, the business. I've got another idea, and that you need that freedom maybe to be doing that as an entrepreneur. So plainly, Phil, that's what you've got with this talk show, and you've got your agency. So you're also doing that. And anyone listening or watching us today can see how Phil has magnificently got his accelerator brand, and then he's also got this brand. So he's able to retain them both brilliantly, and they both support one another, but they're separate but equal. So Phil, you're a testament to how well that can be done.
I'm a testament to something. I'm not sure what it is yet.
No, you are. That's great.
But the other piece, well, I understand exactly what you're saying with an agency, but the thing that the other piece that we do is we come across startups all the time. And one thing startups don't have is budget and a marketing know-how. They've created something, but they don't know how to get it out there. And we get involved, good, bad, or indifferent. We do take a little bit of a risk in getting involved with some startups if we think that they're exciting. And I do that because it excites me. I want to see, oh my God, can we help this guy, help this brand, help this? We have this stable business. Everybody's getting paid. We've got the business, and everything is being paid for. So I'm risking my time and my people's time by not. It's a risk of not being able to take on a paying client versus doing this.
It's
But we do it.
opportunity
Yeah,
cost, isn't it?
it's right. Opportunity cost. It's a but I do it because it's fun, and I try and we've done a number of them, and some successful, some not, but I find they're a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And I think that, part of what you and I were talking about on the show and what I do on my podcast, The Unnoticed Entrepreneur, which then led to, to this book, The Unnoticed Entrepreneur. There are two editions of this, actually. The second edition is coming out in April, published by Wiley,
Yeah.
available on Amazon and all other bookstores, I've been told to say. These entrepreneurs in this book, there are 50 stories here of how people have got themselves noticed without a budget.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in PR, just like when I jumped out of the plane and went to someone and said, hey, if I get this from these people, do you think it's a story? And if I get you this coverage, would you like to give me this story? Right. It's about the arbitrage of creating excitement and interest, because just in the same way that you like to be working with startups because you're interested in them, customers, partners, investors, they want to get involved in businesses that they resonate with, that they connect with, that
Sure.
they're excited about, right? So actually, you don't necessarily have to have a lot of money as an entrepreneur to get noticed. You have to have a lot of enthusiasm for what you do, believe in it. And I'm a real believer in seeing a slightly different angle on things. So in China, for example, I imported the first Morgan sports car. My wife's Shanghainese, and she's brilliant at all the administration. And together we imported this beautiful 4-seater, top-down, 1930s style, but made in the 2000s. So we imported this Morgan Roadster to China, and I had this idea that maybe it could be a business. And one day, the guy was taking pictures of my car outside the shops. I used to drive it to the shops, and I speak enough Chinese, and he had a big camera. And I was like, that is a nice camera. What do you do? So we got chatting, because it turns out he's a journalist. He's a photographer, journalist for a car magazine.
Oh.
So I said, why don't we do a photo shoot for my car in the Forbidden City? And you can see on the side, you can maybe see this picture here is actually part of the Forbidden City being renovated. So what we did is we drove my classic British sports car into the courtyard of the Forbidden City. So you've got Chairman Mao's picture, and then behind that is a courtyard and all these tourists. And we drove my car, no permits, no nothing, because we wouldn't have been given any permits. So we drove the car, and as soon as we stopped the car, the photographers got out and the film crew got out. And we just snap. And of course, it was like bees around a honeypot, because no one had ever seen anything like it. It's the first of these cars ever to be imported. And in China, there's no classic car industry, because there was no car industry. So of course the police came, and we got them talking, and they were kind of amused at my very poor Mandarin. Meanwhile, we kept on taking pictures. So we got enough pictures from that 20 minutes before security arrived, and we drove off. We said, oh, sorry, do it, and I'm like, I would make out like I was terribly sorry, and I got lost, and I shouldn't have been there. I knew I shouldn't have been there, but us foreigners are terrible at these sorts of things, and drove off. But of course, that went on the front cover of a magazine. It was a full 8-page spread. And then I showed that to people. I said, if you want one of these cars, I can order you one. And then I rang the factory and said, hey, I've got a couple of orders. Let me be your importer. Right. So it was a little bit the wrong way around, but I kind of pre-sold, but I used PR to get interest. And so I'd encourage anyone listening to this tonight, to us chatting, to think of something that's not a Google ad. Think of something that's not a Facebook sponsored, one of these drive me nuts ads that comes up and says, have you ever thought about this? You really want to be doing this? And you're like, no, I don't. I get it. I don't want to see these people. Think of something different.
Yeah.
it could be free. Richard Branson famously, when he was arguing about the British Airways blocking him getting landing rights at Heathrow, stood next to, there was a model Concorde outside Heathrow Terminal 1, and he went and he stood naked and got the press.
Yeah.
And he said, this is how we get treated as startups. We get treated like we're naked children. We're not allowed to land our planes. Quite extreme. You don't have to, these days, you might not get away with that. But just encourage anybody that's thinking about a business or has a business, what can you do that makes people go, hey, that's an entrepreneur who really wants that business to succeed. That entrepreneur is willing to go to any lengths at all to get noticed. Because that's the quality that you're looking for if you're going to invest in a company, right? You're looking for a founder who's innovative, maybe a little bit crazy. Maybe, as Mason Harris's name has a book called A Chutzpah, has a little bit of chutzpah. So I really, really encourage people to think not about how much money you've got, but how, I guess as Steve Jobs, how can you think differently? And how can you create an impact with what you've got?
Yeah. I think I was very impressed with your name, the UnNoticed Entrepreneur. And I got it right away because I thought to myself, that's true. Most entrepreneurs, they're not thinking about how am I going to get noticed, or how am I going to break through the clutter? How am I going to do something different? And I'm a big believer in that. We talk about it constantly because people come to us, brands come to us, startup brands or brands that are, trying to scale, struggling with scaling or whatever. And, we'll talk to them and you say, well, what's different about you? And what are you going to do that's different? If you're doing the exact same thing as everybody else and you have the exact same products as everybody else, then your only advantage is who can do it for less money. So you've got to figure out who you are and who you want to be. I'm a big fan of, again, doing things to get noticed, as long as they're not going to hurt anybody, but doing things to get noticed, I think it's the foundation of entrepreneurship. It's exactly what you're talking about. If I'm an entrepreneur and I'm willing to get naked and stand next to a plane to get into the paper to tell my story, I'm dedicated.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, the concept, I'm sure this is called thymos. So in Greek, thymos is the need for recognition, actually, right? So it's quite interesting. When I was researching the book, we actually, at a human chemical level, we have a need to get recognized, which makes sense, right? Because if you're not recognized, your mum's not feeding you, your dad's not taking you to play football, right? So at a biological level, we need to get recognition, and it triggers chemicals because it shows that we're part of our family, our society. We're going to get taken care of, food, shelter, and so on. It extrapolates to the business. The business also has to get noticed. And as an entrepreneur, if you don't embody that spirit of getting noticed and of thymos, then why would the company, how would the company get that? So that's why I think that we have to, as entrepreneurs, be a brand ambassador and a brand champion more than a brand guardian, because a brand guardian is slightly sort of defensive.
Yeah.
And the best entrepreneurs I've had on my podcast have all been people who have articulated, not just in words, but in actions and ways that they feel that they can get the brand in front of the customers or in front of investors in a way that makes them stand out. Because investors, customers, parents have a choice, football coaches, they have a choice. So the UnNoticed really, for me, is a human condition, Phil. It's not just a marketing issue, it's a human condition. And so anyone listening to this going, yeah, I'm not getting noticed. Okay, yes, you don't by definition and by default get noticed.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. You really have to do something. And
Yeah.
what is that going to be that's authentic, that you can defend, doesn't hurt anybody, as you say, maybe makes people have a bit of a chuckle, but that gets you so that people go, hey, I want to deal with that person. I want to buy that person's product or time.
Yeah.
So that's really, I'm glad that you like it, because you know what it's like when you start something like, well, have I got the right name? It's a new business. Have I, you always think, you're going to need to rename the baby a couple of times before you get the right name. But I'm glad you liked it. Thank you.
Yeah. And it definitely is part of what we talk about with people every day is, okay, you've explained to me your business, because again, I do mentor young entrepreneurs, and they'll sit there and explain to you their business, and I go, it's great, I understand the fundamentals, I understand that you understand what you're building, but how are you going to get the message out there? And everybody always goes, well, we're going to do some social media, we're going to do some advertising, we're going to do this. Okay, but how are you going to break through the clutter? How are you going to get noticed? How are you going to do something that's going to get people to stop and say, wow, that's pretty funny, or that's impactful? And again, we did some things, I think I told you on your show about, with the razor company, to get noticed. But I think one of the best that ever did it in the razor company was Dollar Shave Club. I don't know if you ever heard of them or saw them, but Dollar Shave Club was an early one, and he was frustrated. He, like us, he started out, and the first year he was doing traditional marketing, and he just wasn't getting through. And he recognized it, and he took some money and some friends and finagled his way into a warehouse situation. And I think he spent a few $1,000s, but created a video, and it was funny. It was a very funny video. When you get a chance, make a note, just look at Dollar Shave Club video. And he ran it on social media. People responded to it. They started sharing it. The next thing you know, his PR firm shared it, and the next thing you know, it really took off, and he got 2 or 3 million views in one day, and
Yeah.
it really, I think they got 60 or 70,000 orders out of it,
Wow.
and it really launched his business. But it was something that, and it enabled him, honestly, to raise capital, because then the investors said, this guy, this is great.
Yeah.
This guy really believes in this. So
And Phil, I think that the idea of using humor, and there are some people that make videos specifically with comedy. And I think the other thing that's really helping now for entrepreneurs is the medium of podcasts,
yeah,
because traditional media is, in terms of print and radio, has really gone digital and now become more and more automated. The journalists have got sort of less and less time for more and more content, so that's kind
yeah,
of gone out of the way. And a story needs to reach at least a third to a half of the audience of a newspaper for it to be covered. Otherwise, they
yeah,
won't run it. Okay. But with podcasts, we have more and more niche podcasts. It's citizen journalism. And the other key point about podcasts is that you and I can speak, and there isn't a filter.
right,
Whereas if you are with a newspaper, the journalist would interview you, and then you look at. In fact, often they don't even share with you the article, right? And then it come out, and you go, "I never said that," or "Oh, they only took this piece of the story," or they didn't understand that." Especially with tech, you find out they miss it. So with podcasts, you have a direct voice. And, I've started a course called the Podcast Guest Blueprint, which takes entrepreneurs all the way through from how to find the podcast through to setting up the technology, the lights and the mics and the camera, and then how to find the podcast and how to pitch those podcasts, and then how to make an offer, how to turn the listeners into leads, either by giving free giveaways, books, for example, but also by giving quizzes or creating quizzes. There's a very good app here called Score App with Daniel Priestley and the team there. And what we're seeing is podcasts are really a great way for people to build relationships with other communities, because the podcast host introduced you. You're kind of like a treasured guest. You're an
yeah,
invited guest. So you have this amazing position. You have a community that is already pre-built. You take them an offer of some kind, a quiz or a download a book, and then they go into your CRM, right? And then the absolute sort of golden goose then is you can use AI to repurpose the content. So in my course, I have a module on repurposing the podcast, because then you can cut it into clips, as you know, using repurpose.ai or Riverside, or you can take it into Otter to make a transcript if you don't get given the transcript, and then you can use something like Claude or ChatGPT to write you an article. And, with my clients that come on the podcast, they're making 7, 8, 9 pieces of content from one show that goes on Facebook, LinkedIn, X, Medium. And then you can embed the call to action within the content from the podcast. So podcasting for entrepreneurs is really low cost because it doesn't cost anything to get on. Some hosts want to charge, but really most shows don't charge.
Right.
You get access, direct access, and you get this amazing piece of content that you can repurpose. So entrepreneurs now can really leverage podcasts, I think, and you get to do video, so you can stand out. You can, wear your branded merchandise. You can cut it into cool shorts. So I think, Phil, the opportunities now created by platforms like the one we're using, Wave here, for example, or by platforms like Repurpose and obviously YouTube, we can all be publishers.
Yeah.
Right. We can all be publishers. So it's super, super powerful, Phil, really. And just encourage any entrepreneurs to think about standing out, but using not just the tried and tested, but being a personality on shows like you're kindly hosting. Yeah. So I think it's fantastically opportunistic for people.
I agree with you. I think a lot of people say, well, the world has changed and there's not so many opportunities in the press but I think there's more opportunities and easier opportunities to get to. And it's not just about being a guest on podcasts. I see a tremendous amount of opportunity on YouTube and places like that for entrepreneurs to get their message out themselves. But as I coach people, you have to have something to say. You have to have a direction. You have to understand what you're trying to get across, because if you're just going to go out there and just pitch, it's not going to work. You've got to be able to add value and provide value to the listener.
And I think, Phil, you're absolutely right about that. And the other corollary to that is that you have to stand for something. So it's one thing to add value, which is sort of offering a solution or insight. But if it's just, hey, yeah, I agree with everybody else, this is how I would do that. It's like, okay. And I think maybe the point here is to decide as an entrepreneur whether you want to provide a commodity, in which case it's about price and efficiency. And normally that is the preserve of people with scale, right? Or a new technology that radically alters the workflow for traditional business. Or are you going to be in the value add part? And as you know, really everything's on a continuum. It's either value add or commodity. And you're either going one way or the other. It's like there's no real room for middle class. You're getting richer or poorer, right? It's a terrible place to be in the middle. So because I also work with entrepreneurs and I provide, business coaching. I have what I call the business clarity program. And I really work with entrepreneurs on helping them to define what they want to stand for,
right,
and take a position on something, and then become a thought leader on that, because that's how they then become at the value end of the conversation with clients. I mean, like the higher value rather than the commodity end. And so the economics are, you need to decide you're going to be a commodity, high volume, low value. And that's great if you want to do that. It takes more capital. Or at the higher value, but the higher value has to have a position, right? It has to have a position on things. So I'm sure you're doing that with your entrepreneurs, Phil, as well, is getting them to take a stand. And don't be afraid that some people won't like you and some people will.
Yeah.
But better than no one be able to make a decision. They just go, well, yeah, I just don't really remember that guy or that woman. You do need to be memorable.
Yeah. Yeah, it's same with business. I mean, it's not just about, the entrepreneur as an individual, but it's also about the business. It's the same thing. We preach it all the time. If we do an analysis and we can show you six competitors that are doing exactly the same thing as you're doing with the exact same products and the exact same price, you have to change if you want to survive, or you're constantly going to be on this treadmill of running and trying to figure out how to lower your price to or offer something. So
Yeah.
we just went through it with a client, but sometimes people have to hear it and they don't want to hear it. They think that they have, in their minds, they are different, right? Well, we're different because you're going, well, does the consumer see it that way? So
And I'm always amazed in a way that companies become so risk averse.
yeah,
And in a way, that's what this is about, right? It's about getting comfortable, having enough clients, and seeking sort of the lowest common denominator. It's the lowest common denominator on HR. We pay everybody well enough. We provide a product that's good enough, right? We deliver fast enough,
yeah,
as opposed to the aspirational, which is where a business starts. No one ever starts a business going, I'm going to be good enough.
yeah.
I'm going to be, I'm going to be produce a product that's good enough and
Yeah,
I'll deliver it when no one starts a business that way, right? And it's like we sort of get to the stage almost of middle age where we go, well, I guess I'm just a bit slow now, and kind of almost accept the atrophy of age. And that, I think, is really then the death knell. And you see that where companies stop innovating, where they stop really caring, and they've got maybe a good lawyer instead to write contracts that people can't get out of, or they have non-compete clauses with their staff because the staff want to leave. They threaten them rather than engage them, right?
yeah,
These are kind of the hallmarks of these companies that you don't want to invest in because they're not doing anything really sustainable, right? They're on those supermarket aisles and it's sort of, they're the ones with the big sales promotions. So I think, I'm sure you're doing this as well, but the path to sustainable growth for any business, and I believe also as a human, is innovation,
yeah,
right? You have to keep thinking of things that you haven't done before. That's why I sold my PR business that I'd owned for 25 years, because as I move, I'm 57 now, Phil, I thought, well, I could do this for another 10 years. My friends are like, keep the business. You've done it for 25 years, another 10, you can retire. I go, yeah, but for 10 years, I'm going to be bored.
yeah,
How do I grow? So I have to change and become a property owner, build a brand, build a
yeah,
podcast, and I have a radio show and the books, challenge myself.
yeah,
So
exactly.
as you're doing too. So as entrepreneurs, when we stop innovating, then we have to, I think, really think through whether we're the right person to lead that business and whether it's time to move on.
Yeah, I agree. We are amazingly almost out of time within.
Sorry, Phil, I've used up all your
Not,
airtime, mate. Sorry.
it's not your fault. The conversation was wonderful. So, um, any last parting, uh, any last parting words for prospective entrepreneurs? Anybody out there that's listening? One tidbit of information, and then also let's give them how they can get in touch with you. What obviously the all your information will be in the description, all your links and stuff, but also to just give them how they can get in touch with you
Yeah.
and your book.
Thank you, Phil. I think if there's one, I'm not going to call it advice because, I'm learning as well, right? So I wouldn't want to claim that I know everything. If it's an insight, it's that every entrepreneur's journey is different and that there is not a one size fits all. And in my book, I have, his 50, and I have 450 entrepreneurs who come on my show. I started EO in Beijing with Rich Robinson, a good mate of mine who now lives in Bali. So we had hundreds of entrepreneurs go through that. And the joy of being an entrepreneur is that there isn't one formula that you have to follow.
Right.
You can decide how you want to be an entrepreneur,
That's right.
right? My one golden rule is you have to add value.
Yeah.
That is the universal truth. If you forget that, you will go out of business.
Yeah.
But so my one insight would be, if anyone's thinking about being an entrepreneur, is that think about how you would like to add value and then bring your own personality and your own style to that. You don't have to follow anyone else's. This is the joy of being an entrepreneur. There isn't a uniform.
Yeah.
You know, there's a wardrobe, and it's up to you to decide what garment to wear.
Yeah. How do people get in touch with you? How do they find you?
Yeah, they can go to jimajames.com. That's the best place. And that has got my books, the podcast, The UnNoticed Entrepreneur, is on all the players and also on YouTube. But if they come to jimajames.com, Phil, that is probably the easiest place to start. That would be
Okay.
wonderful. And obviously, my details are on there. People can book a meeting. They can look at the courses. They can look at the books. They can see my radio show, and even see some videos about China and things like that on there. So more than happy to respond to anybody that's listened to this show, and love to have any questions from people. So thank you for asking.
That's great. I apologize, but we're out of time. We talked so much, and it was a pleasure having you on. It was a great conversation, a lot of great insight, and I appreciate it.
Phil, thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you don't get charged by the minute, because
No.
I've cost you a lot of money. Thank you very
No,
much
it's
indeed for
fine.
giving me your time.
It's fine. Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I just have some closing things to do, so I'm going to pop you out of the stream.
Okay, then I'll say 再见, which is goodbye in Chinese.
A great show. I enjoyed it, and unfortunately, we ran a little bit late, so I don't have a lot of things to discuss. Just remember, if you scan this QR code, you can get a free download at my site on your business planning tool. It's a great business planning tool. So take advantage of that. And just remember that this show is 100% supported by Crunch Growth. So, if anybody needs our assistance, you can always find me on Phil at crunchgrowth.com. You can always go to crunchgrowth.com. And I appreciate you taking your time this evening. Next week after, we've got some great shows coming up with some great entrepreneurs. You can look in the guide; you'll get some emails about it. And but we're running very tight, so I'm gonna have to close it up. But thank you for tuning in. We're exposed to over 5,000 ads every day. We see ads everywhere. So it's no surprise that consumers need to see an ad multiple times before they take action. Our clients love us because Crunch Growth makes your brand stand out online. Our team creates content that makes better ads, better posts, better videos that break through the clutter. Crunch Growth's team has been working in the digital world since the dawn of e-commerce. From social media to advertising to Amazon management to web design and development to branding, we help your brand succeed online profitably. Contact us at www.crunchgrowth.com.